Yes, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Planning Policy and Built Heritage Working Party for Monday, the 16th of August. I think if we just check first off on the agenda, apologies for absence. I think we have one, Councillor Mancini-Boyle and Councillor Holliday is substituting. I understand, Linda?
Yes, that's correct, but I don't believe Councillor Holliday has joined the meeting as yet.
Right, okay. Well, perhaps we should just give it a few more minutes, maybe, before we actually launch into the agenda proper. I see Councillor Kershaw is on the phone.
There has been, Mr. Chairman, in North Norfolk, especially around Cromer, a lot of issues over the weekend. So that might be a problem. It might just be technical issues.
I have just had an email from Victoria, who's trying to get into the meeting. She's now been forwarded the invitation details, so hopefully we'll see her shortly.
Right. Okay. I think we should just give a little bit of time.
Well, there you go, Mr. Chairman. A nice little bit of ESP there. Extra reception.
Thank you, Councillor Pearce.
It has been very bad over the weekend. It started Friday night and it just keeps dropping out. It's not very stable up here, and I suppose it's obviously due to the tourists using, the mass increase of tourists, which I'm sure is making everything slower and prone to overuse for the capacity that we've got. So I was being trying to be helpful there.
Yeah.
But you're not the only one, Nigel. I was talking to Andrew earlier this morning, and I said I think I'm going to have trouble with my devices here, because I said the connections have been terrible over this last few days. So it must be sort of in our area. I couldn't use the laptop after all, Andrew. I've had to go onto the iPad.
Right.
Okay. Just give me a second, people. There's somebody coming to knock on my door. I've not wish to offend anybody by appearing to leave.
Has she got in yet, Matt?
Sorry, yeah, Victoria has just joined the meeting.
Okay, fine.
Yes. Good morning, Councillor Holliday. Pleased that you've managed to get everything working in the end. So I think we're probably good to go, Matt.
Yeah, I think you
from here
likely
on,
have everyone you're expecting for today, I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Right, so to item number 2, I understand there are no public questions. Am I correct in that?
That's correct. We have no public questions today.
Thank you very much, Linda. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of July. If I can turn you to pages 1 to 8, isn't it, on the agenda? If we can just go through these page by page and check for their accuracy. Any comments? Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, and finally page 8. Any questions, comments, queries? No, none evident. Could I please have a proposer for these minutes? Councillor Pearce is proposing, and a seconder, please. Councillor Fisher seconding. Thank you very much. Perhaps we should just show our hands to record that we do approve those minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you. So on to the next item on the agenda, which is items of urgent business? I'm not aware of any. Is that correct, Linda?
I'm not aware of any, and
No.
Mark is shaking his head.
Right. Thank you very much. And item 5, declarations of interest. Can I ask anyone here now to declare any interest, pecuniary or otherwise, in accordance with the guidance on pages 9 and 10 of the agenda? I don't see anybody wanting to do so. Thank you very much. Item number 6, update on matters from previous meeting. I don't have any items, but Mark, no, but shaking. Thank you very much. So we launch into item 7, first of the 2 main items on the agenda, publication of new national planning policy framework. They come around quite frequently, these updates and amendments to the national policy planning framework. So over to you, Mark, if you want to give your presentation. Thank you very much.
Can you just confirm that I've shared my screen with you there, Chair?
Yeah, yes, you have. Thank you.
Okay, so I've just put this on to remind me what I wrote, to be honest with you. It's easier for me to present if I just sort of read through generally, if I can find the item in a minute. So, yeah, this is the publication of the National Planning Policy Framework. As the Chair said, we've had probably 3 or 4 versions of this over the last couple of years. Hopefully this will be the consolidated sort of version we're going to see for some time. The importance of it is twofold, really. For local plan purposes, of what we're working on, preparing a new local plan, one of the tests of soundness is that the local plan should be in conformity with the National Planning Policy Framework. So if you produce a local plan that doesn't conform with that framework, then you're likely to get into trouble through the examination process, and the inspector's going to ask you to look again at some of your policies. Conformity doesn't mean precisely replicate. So the National Planning Policy Framework's got wriggle room in it for each local authority to do things slightly differently, sort of shades of grey, if you like. But you can't depart too far from what national policy says. So it's important for us that we make sure that our local plan, the one we're about to submit for examination, conforms with this latest guidance that's been published. The second area where it's important is in making decisions on planning applications. So for those local authorities that have got dated plans, as ours is, our current core strategy is quite old now, the National Planning Policy Framework gets increasing weight. So anything which is in the framework, which is different to what's in our core strategy, you'd normally expect the framework to take some precedence because it's more current and more up to date. So it's important for plan making, and it's important when we're making planning applications. Has anybody found on the papers where this report actually is? Can somebody shout out a page number for me?
11,
page 11.
Page 11, agenda
Thank
item
you.
7. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So hands up, what I've put here is a sort of cut and paste exercise from something that somebody else did. So it's not my own words, there's lots of material on the internet now, which summarises the main changes to the framework document. I'm not going to go through them all in lots of detail because some of them are not relevant, but I'm just going to pick out some of the main highlights and perhaps give a little bit of local context. So this first change about design quality, we've discussed this before. This is all the stuff that the government have now included around beauty. The word beauty now appears several times in the NPPF. It wasn't in there before. There will be, I suspect, lots of discussion about what beauty actually means. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. What I like, you may not like. And I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting discussions at development committees and through the appeals process as to what beauty actually means. There's always been a requirement for high quality design in development. A lot of the representations which were made when they consulted on this change were about the focus on appearance, that beauty was a bit one-dimensional. It's what things look like rather than what they function like. But what you'll see in the new NPPF is sort of both strands are there now. You've got this enhanced requirement to deliver beautiful development, but it sits alongside what was always in the framework about well-designed places. And there's now encouragement for local authorities to publish local design guides and design codes to lay out what they regard as well-designed places, what beauty might be in North Norfolk as opposed to somewhere else in the country. Not a surprise that this was coming. It's been consulted on, heavily trailed. You remember it appeared in all the white paper consultation material 8 or 9 months ago now. So we knew this was coming, and it's largely reflected in the new local plan. It's not a surprise. It's not a dramatic change. And we'll make sure that the supporting text in the local plan reflects the latest sort of guidance. I'm not going to pause for breath. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of these and then open up sort of conversation at the end, so I can go through the whole lot. Emphasis on using trees in new development. This is a bit of an intriguing thing. Professionally, there's some sort of consternation about this, I think, because it says in words that planning policies and decisions should ensure that new streets are tree lined, which sounds very, there's a lot of emphasis on tree planting nowadays. How we will ensure that all new streets are tree lined in a lot of development proposals, to be frank, is a bit beyond me. I think of some of the places that I go and visit that I think are really nice in North Norfolk, the conservation areas in, middle of Blakeney or Wells or Cromer, or, all of those sort of urban spaces, if you like, not got many trees in them. So why it is that all new development should have tree-lined streets, I'm not entirely sure. And I'm sure this will be open again to lots of interpretation and discussion. The broad principles about incorporating trees within development and protecting those trees that already exist, obviously right. And there's also provision in here to ensure that ongoing maintenance is taken care of. So I suppose what this will do is it will push the sort of green agenda a little bit and encourage applicants and planning authorities to think more carefully about trees within development. Whether it will result in tree-lined boulevards in every location up and down the country, I'm sceptical of, but we'll see what happens. The presumption in favour of sustainable development, I'll just explain what that means and why it's important. So when you have an out-of-date local plan, so if your plan's not delivering sufficient development, if you can't demonstrate a 5-year land supply, if your policies are out of kilter with national guidance, to the extent that you can't rely on your local plan to make decisions, then something called the presumption in favour of development comes into play. I've missed out an important word there. It's a presumption in favour of sustainable development. So in effect, where there's a policy vacuum, the presumption should be that you grant planning permission for sustainable development. Lots of debate and conjecture about what sustainable development actually looks like. Government's attempt to clarify that a little bit says sustainable development is development which meets the needs of the area. So it's important that sustainable development must meet needs. That's a relatively new test. So we've got a housing target, for example, in our plan. Sustainable development is development which achieves the housing target. It's driven by demand and need for growth. And that's reflected in the definition of what sustainable development is. We should align that growth with necessary supporting infrastructure, should improve the environment, should mitigate climate change, making effective use of brownfield sites. There are lots of words in there, and the courts will have a great deal of fun in trying to work out what it all means, and there'll be lots of challenges, and people will interpret what that means in slightly different ways. But it's an improved definition compared to the one which is in the current framework. Importantly, climate change is now getting merged into the definitions of sustainable development. So sustainable development previously used to say economic, social, environmental. Now sort of fairly routinely climate change is tagged in there as well. So climate change is clearly, jumping up the agenda very, very rapidly and is now getting embedded into lots of policy documents across government, including in the MPPF. Article 4 directions, which I know are topical at the moment in some areas. I'll explain what these are to start with. So planning law includes a definition of development. It's pretty much anything that a builder has to do with development, and changing the use of a building or land is development. So nearly huge amounts of things would fall within the definition of development. To avoid the need for all of those things to require planning permission, government has introduced permitted development rights. So it's saying these things are development, but they do not need planning permission because we are permitting them nationally. So lots of small scale development does not need planning permission. So you don't need an army of planning officers dealing with very minor proposals because those things do not require planning permission. And it's been one of the features of this government, and to some extent the last one, that they've been deregulating planning and introducing lots of permitted development allowances for new types of development. And some of them are quite significant development proposals. Notable ones, you can now convert agricultural buildings up to 5 dwellings under permitted development. You can now convert offices to dwellings under permitted development. You can now convert lots of shops to alternative uses under permitted development. Those things do not require planning permission. An Article 4 direction removes those permitted development rights locally in a defined geographical area. So it's a tool that local authorities can use to reinstate the need for planning permission where nationally planning permission is not required. What this new provision in the MPPF is saying is I'm going to paraphrase this, government has introduced these permitted development rights intentionally to remove planning controls over those types of development, and local authorities shouldn't routinely just impose Article 4 directions as a measure to reinstate controls. They should have evidence as to why exercising permitted development rights is damaging in a particular area. And the example that's quoted here, authorities have got lots of office accommodation. We don't have lots of office accommodation in North Norfolk, but many local authorities, their local economy is office based. And the allowance which allows offices to convert into dwellings has resulted in lots of landlords, kicking out their tenants, converting their offices into residential apartment blocks, without those apartment blocks contributing towards Section 106 agreements and other community benefits. And that's caused some local authorities a bit of a headache. And their response has been to serve Article 4 directions, removing that permitted development allowance for conversion of office to residential, reinstating the need for planning permission to be secured. And government here is basically saying we're not very happy with that. You need to retain national permitted development rights unless there's very clear evidence to the contrary. So it's sort of discouraging the widespread use of Article 4 directions. They can be used, but they're sort of discouraging it. Just bear with me. Retain and explain statutes. I don't know, I was scratching my head. I was trying to think if we've got any statutes in North Norfolk. Somebody's going to say we have got some, but I don't know whether we've got any statutes to sort of slave traders or any controversial ones. Why this has appeared in planning legislation, I'm not sure. I assume it's because some of the statutes will be scheduled ancient monuments and will fall under planning control. Government saying here essentially don't remove them, explain what they mean. There's been lots of sort of press coverage about that, so it's not a surprise. Encouragement for local authorities to deal with significant sort of public sector buildings, education, colleges, hospitals and prisons quickly through the sort of pre-application advice process and removing the blockages to those types of development. I don't suppose we'll get many of those. I'd hope we deal with them relatively quickly anyway. Linking the United Nations climate change goals into sustainable development. I'm not familiar with all 17 goals, but I'm sure that is a good thing. Changes to flood risk. I think this has always been there, but it's now explicitly sort of stated that development proposals should deal with what's called residual flood risk. So this is the sort of thing where you would, tarmac a large area and push your surface water drainage onto an adjacent landowner's property. You've got a responsibility to deal with that. You should be dealing with that residual risk as part of your development proposal. And the way that that is done, modern sort of drainage systems are, open water courses, sustainable urban drainage systems, they call them, where the presumption is you deal with your own surface water drainage on the site rather than putting it down a pipe and giving it to somebody else to deal with. You deal with as much of your surface water locally as possible. Next appears to be a relatively modest change, but it might have fairly significant implications. This relates to what you'll probably call para 79 dwellings. These are the exceptional one-off dwellings in the countryside. You've had a handful of them at Development Committee over the last few years. This was originally the sort of John Gummer sort of intervention into planning many moons ago, where he wanted to create the opportunity for modern sort of stately homes in landscape ground to be created. He thought that was part of the history of England, didn't want to see that stopped, so wanted to create this exceptional route where you could get permission for a house in the countryside, provided it was, a very exceptional sort of building. And the words in paragraph 79 currently say truly outstanding or innovative. And there've been lots of debate about what innovative in that word I can't say means, and it's now been deleted. So in order to get planning permission under what was paragraph 79, now paragraph 80, your proposal must be truly outstanding. So that doesn't resolve the problem about what does truly outstanding actually mean and who determines what it is. But it's a sort of simplification. It will be useful. It now means in order to get permission, you've got to produce a truly outstanding building. It'll be interesting for the Development Committee to decide whether something truly outstanding or not. Next one is about 10% of all major housing schemes comprising of affordable home ownership products. So just by way of background, affordable homes are delivered either via a rented product or via a home ownership product, or sometimes a combination of both. Home ownership, the government's preferred tenure now for home ownership is their first homes product. Their first homes product is the 30% discount on open market value with occupancy controls and perpetuity clauses attached. So essentially in North Norfolk, what that's going to mean is probably shared ownership and shared equity affordable homes are going to get replaced with these first homes products instead. And this clarification, although I'm not sure clarification was required, says that the requirement is 10% of the total number of dwellings. So if you're building 100 dwellings, 10% of those 10 units have got to be low cost home ownership affordable products in order to secure planning permission. That's reflected in the local plan. We've had that requirement in for some time. It's not a surprise. Next requirement about new settlements having a genuine choice of transport modes. This will probably only come up in relation to probably Fakenham and North Walsham, the large urban extensions. And this genuine choice of transport modes is about making sure there's footways, cycleways, bus stops, connections to the railway station and so on, so they don't become car dominated development proposals. Again, that would be reflected in our schemes anyway. And then laying the groundwork for what is to come, demonstrating net biodiversity gain in development proposals. Again, the local plan's got a new policy in it talking about 10% net biodiversity gain in all development proposals. So we're not surprised by that. Bit of clarification about neighbourhood plans, basically saying neighbourhood plans can, if they want to, allocate large, small, medium-sized development sites. I don't know why, but it was assumed that neighbourhood plans couldn't propose large development proposals. Well, if those large development proposals comply with the local plan in place locally, then there's nothing stopping neighbourhoods taking on the mantle and allocating large development sites if they choose to. I picked up on the implications for the local plan. To be honest, all of these changes were things that we saw coming. They've all been consulted on. The policies in the new plan incorporate all of these specific requirements. I've got no concerns about soundness and our ability to defend the plan. There's nothing dramatic in terms of change of direction here. As I say, it's all been sort of heavily sort of signposted and signalled. So that's me done, and I'll answer any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that walkthrough. Would you like to? Thank you. Thank you very much for taking down the graphic. Yeah, I think this is encouraging that we have anticipated a number of these measures being potentially coming into effect at a later date in the drafting of the local plan policies. I'd just like to pick up on one particular section on page 13 about Article 4 directions. I know that there is some concern locally that the staycation expansion of camping sites from 28 to 56 days is a potential threat to our AONB landscape. And there is concern in certain areas that that we have so far pulled back from considering any Article 4 directive, as it were, withdrawal, because it relates to a wide geographical area. Now, that argument has been put forward for the reason not to take any action to better manage the proliferation of these campsites. And so it's interesting to note that in the remarks or the comments, it says that some local authorities have imposed these in wide geographical areas. Is the geographical area only in relation to built development, or can it be in relation to development such as pop-up campsites, for want of a better expression?
Right, okay. So I would say an Article 4 direction is a very targeted tool. It's not one that you should use as an authority to reintroduce blanket controls across a big geographical area just because you don't like the permitted development allowance which is available in that area. And I'll illustrate that. When the government introduced that allowance for 56-day camping on land, caravan sites camping on land across the country, they did so for a particular reason because of the economic impacts of the COVID and so on. And they had the choice at that time to exclude AONB or national parks or any other area that they wanted to in laying out that new permitted development allowance, and chose not to. So there was a reason why they did it. Now, I'm not saying we cannot use it as a tool, and if we're confident we can point to some adverse impacts, then it's a tool which is available to us. I mean, I don't know whether it's universally the opinion that caravanning, camping in the AONB is having the impact that you describe or not. The presumption is that government changed the rules for a particular reason, and it made that change at a national level across all AONBs, all national parks, all other geographies. And therefore, the local authority got to demonstrate why the circumstances are so different in North Norfolk that we think we should, reinstate controls in the way that Article 4 would allow us to do it. So it's an evidence-based sort of process. What is the harmful impact that you're trying to address? And would reintroducing the need for planning permission address that harmful impact or not? Why has government specifically put that measure in the new MPPF? Because it's concerned that local authorities are abusing the situation and reimposing controls in areas where government don't think those controls are necessary. So it's a sort of cautionary shot across the bows, really. If you're going to use Article 4s, you need to be very sure you've got the evidence to justify their use. Because you're essentially removing somebody's legal entitlement to do something on land without planning permission. That's what you would do if you served an Article 4 direction. You would say, you now need planning permission for this. Nobody else does, but in our area you do. So you've got to have evidence for using it as a tool locally.
Thank you for that, Mark. That's very, very clear, and I think that will be useful for areas within our district that have concerns about the knock-on effects of the opening up of the staycation proposals, which are laudable in themselves, I have to say. But thank you for that. Can I just open it up to other members? Open the floor up for any questions or comments that they may have.
Got Councillor Toy has a raised hand.
Yep, Councillor Toy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark, the new paragraph 80, what was 79, and we've had a few pop up lately. Being as that's going to be a debatable thing, are we able to write a local guide of what might be acceptable to us under the new rules? Just a curiosity question, really.
Yes, you can. You can produce any number of sort of guides. You could call it a best practice guide. You could do an internal note for officers in terms of interpreting policy, or you could go so far as to produce a supplementary planning document and consult on it and take it through a process of preparation, which would give us more weight in the decision-making process. I have to say, I'm not sure what such a guide might say, John. I think, the word which is used there is open to lots of different interpretations, and trying to write down what our interpretation of that might be quite a difficult task. But there's nothing stopping you saying, that new paragraph 80, we want to understand what it says. We want others to understand what it says locally, and you can produce your own guide. All of that sort of guidance material, internal practice notes, best practice guides, SPD documents, they're all less significant than a policy in a local plan. So they carry weight, but they're less weighty than a specific policy in a local plan. But yeah, if members felt there was appetite, how many of these proposals do we actually get, John? 3 or 4 a year, maybe. Whether it's something that we'd want to spend significant amount of resource and time producing, or whether we can just deal with those 3 or 4 planning applications in the way that we currently do is an area that we probably ought to debate. I'm probably at the value of it, given the relatively small number of applications that we have.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's whether we want to have a debate as to if we want to produce one, perhaps in this working group at some time in the future. We've obviously got a plan to deliver at the moment, but I think it's something we could debate whether we wanted to put the effort into producing something, if that makes sense. But I'll leave that for Mr. Chairman to decide and with yourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting on that, John, that initially I think the framework said that development had to be both innovative and high quality. And then it was changed so that the two were mutually exclusive. So you could either have high quality or innovative development. And now innovation has gone. Presumably innovation has gone because although buildings can be an innovation, they may not necessarily be high quality in themselves. So it's interesting how this has evolved with time. We'll see how that plays out. But we do have a North Norfolk design guide, don't we, Mark? So possibly that could be tweaked moving forward at some stage.
Yeah, it could. I mean, in principle, some guidance could be produced. What I'm sort of saying is that, you know, if I asked all of you on the screen, what do you understand the meaning of truly outstanding? What are the criteria that result in a truly outstanding building that would be relevant in North Norfolk? We might all come up with different things. I mean, we might coalesce around some core principles, which might be helpful to put in a document. But you know, I can think of examples of some very, very modern buildings, which I think are the best thing since sliced bread, which probably half the people on the screen would think were a hideous monstrosity and shouldn't be built anywhere in the district. It's such a subjective area. And as I say, I think because there's such a small number of these proposals, I'd be prepared to throw myself on the mercy of the development committee to make a decision on a case-by-case basis, advised by officers around what our opinions are. And I'm not persuaded of the value of lots of detailed guidance in that sort of area when we have such a small number of proposals. It's not me shying away from doing the work, but I think there's perhaps some bigger fish to fry at the moment, given that there's a relatively modest number of proposals that we get in North Norfolk for that type of scheme. Others might have a different opinion.
Yes, well, if only the government would take the same approach to its white paper and definition of what constitutes beauty. That is a worry to a lot of planning officers, I would assume, in having a government definition of what is a beautiful form of development as compared to what exists locally and what we regard in a local context as being beautiful. But that is probably for another day. Any other questions or
You've
any
got
comments?
Councillor Virginia Gay, followed by Councillor Paul Heinrich.
Virginia, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. My comment did refer to beauty and to design, which seems to come first here on this list. And I wanted to emphasise that we do have an excellent design guide, a part of the new local plan. It has been rewritten. And North Norfolk has always been renowned for its design guides and policies. But I'd just like to say that the important thing is how that guide is interpreted and what the general level of understanding of it is. And I was going to suggest, in view of the importance of this for the future, maybe it's time to have another presentation on the design guide, because I think there may be many new members who don't actually know much about it. And I wonder if I know it's more work and another block of time that has to be set aside, but I wonder if it might be helpful. And I don't mean for us on this working party, I mean something that all members are invited to. I don't know, does that sound useful to you, Mark?
Yes, Virginia. I mean, it is obviously another work stream, but if your perception is that the profile of that document has sort of waned a little bit, we have got a number of new members. I think the new design guide's not yet been finalised, has it, Virginia? So there's a working draft of it that's been prepared. I know Paul Rhymes did a lot of work on it a year or so ago. I don't think that final version has been formally endorsed. So we do need to look at that. Again, I'm mindful of resources. The local plan's got to take priority. We've got to get it in for, examination as soon as we possibly can. So your question as a working party to ask us to bring an item and to extend an invite. If you want to use the working party as the forum for that and extend an invite to all members, because I think it should go to all members. It's not just the working party. And you asked me to put that on the work programme. That's something we can do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gay, for your input on that. I think that would be useful at some point in time when we've perhaps got to the end of the local plan process. We can have a look at that. I think that would probably be appropriate. Councillor Heinrich.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Mark, coming back to the sustainable development section, don't see a huge change there from what we already do, but I wonder whether any further guidance strengthens that, to look, for example, at passive house standards as a requirement for new builds, at ground source heat pumps, provision of electric charging points as part of the absolute requirement, or whether we still have to put up with poorly insulated little boxes that are not going to be wholly sustainable.
Right, okay. So your new local plan, which has got a specific standard in it that must be met, will require the sort of building techniques that you're referring to. The dilemma, what you don't want to do is specify a particular house type, like say a passive house or a ground source heat pump or an air source heat pump or triple glazed windows or solar panels on the roof, because there's such a variety of different things that you can use, all of which contribute to meeting that specific requirement. That I think what you should do is you should set in your policy, which is what you've done, that each house should deliver I think it's a 31% improvement over and above the current building regulations. How people achieve the 31% is to pick from a list of different types of building techniques in order to get to that particular standard, rather than saying every house in North Norfolk should be a passive house, or every house in North Norfolk should have solar panels on the roof, or every group of 10 houses should have a wind turbine at the bottom of one of the gardens. You know, there are multiple ways of meeting that requirement, and the policy shouldn't attempt to specify one over and above another. People should be able to pick and choose how they get to that standard. What I can say is 31% is quite an onerous uplift on where we currently are. You know, we're not sitting back and saying, let's just let the development industry build what they want to build. That standard is going to be pretty difficult to achieve in most of North Norfolk. And it's going to include things like ground source heat pumps and so on that you refer to in order to get there. It's not just a case of, you know, putting up thermal linings on your curtains and hoping for the best. It's a major shift in policy approach in terms of building specification, most of which will emerge into the building regulations eventually. So planning officers needn't worry too much about it, because it'll come into the national building regulations as a construction standard fairly shortly, I think, the way things are going.
Thank you. It confirms a position I thought we were at. I'm glad we're going to get the new building regulations shortly. I think that will strengthen our hand considerably. 31%, it's onerous, but potentially it's not enough. We might need to look further.
Yeah, as technology improves and local plans now, you know, we wrote our core strategy, 10, 12, 15 years ago, and it's been in place a long time. New local plans are probably going to have a lifetime of about 5 years, Paul. They're going to be continuously reviewed and updated. And in this area around climate change, you know, there'll be things in 5 years' time we're not even talking about today. You know, who knows what the impact of things like hydrogen are going to be and so on. And I think that'll be an area of policy that will evolve and change sort of over time pretty swiftly. But I'm confident that we're pushing about as hard as we can possibly push at the moment, given what we know.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
Councillor Grove-Jones.
I think you had Councillor Pearce first, sorry.
Sorry, Matt. Councillor Pearce and then Councillor Grove-Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to come to the word that is dear to Pauline's heart and my heart as well, trees. It is a bit, it is very woolly. I mean, obviously, what has been said there, you know, we need to discuss it for the simple reason is we have a lot of developments that come through to us where everybody either wants to remove a tree or we've got large situations where nobody wants to put any trees. And then we get the odd applicant that declares war on a tree and tries to take a tree down without permission. It does cause us an awful lot of stress, unnecessary costs and elongated work streams, as you've said this morning. We've got to have a look at it, what decides what becomes a tree. I mean, don't forget, in a lot of developments, we put young trees so they grow. We don't put mature trees in. And yet we've had a couple of developments where in the past it's been specified we put mature trees in. I think this is something that you, Mark, your team especially, with guidance to us, we're going to lean more on. Because if we reject something because we don't feel there's enough trees, the applicant may well say, I appeal. And he may well appeal on the fact that, you know, we haven't allowed for enough trees, or the other way around, we've allowed for a tree and he doesn't want it. I mean, you know, I can see where you're coming from. And it's something that we as a committee, along with the climate change and being green and everything else and biodiversity and etc., is something that's going to be, like as you've just said, more and more relevant. I mean, maybe you can't say anything now, but I do think what they've said here, I think the intention is good, but I do think that at this moment, and looking at it here, it's extremely woolly. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think all we can really say is we've moved from a position where there was no reference in the NPPF to street trees to one where there is reference in the NPPF to street trees. So in a scenario where there's an appeal, the test is going to be our government inspectors going to stand behind their own government guidance and start supporting local authorities who want to, in the right circumstances, incorporate street trees into their development. And as I say, I think this will be one of the areas that will be tested through the courts fairly early on. You know, a volume house builder, I won't name any of them, but you know, some of them put trees in, some of them don't. It's going to put a planning application into an authority. Perhaps it will be us that won't have tree-lined streets, and that local authority is going to, you know, refer to the NPPF and it's going to refuse planning permission. And the developer is going to take a test case through an appeal and through the courts to find out what street trees, what that line actually means. As I say, I mean, I can see a scenario that they're perfectly acceptable developments in my mind dotted throughout the district where there are no trees, you know, an urban development in the middle of Cromer or in the middle of Blakeney or, you know, one of the high density sort of conservation areas where buildings sit cheek by jowl, you know, they're on the back edge of the pavement, they've got on very small plot sizes, and that contributes positively to the character of the area. And there simply is not room for trees. There are no trees on the site. A local authority in that scenario, which tries to insist on trees within the development, might be on a sticky wicket. I don't know the answer, Nigel. I don't know the answer. We'll have to see how it works out. One of the things which is in the back of my mind, and it's significant, is the land take for trees in streets is enormous. If you think of every single, you know, residential street that we approve on a large volume house builder estate development, having to find room for trees along the carriageways, it's going to have a very, very significant implication in terms of density development and so on. May well be a desirable thing and something that we will aspire to, and you know that you've been asking for some time. But I think it will have quite significant implications on land values. You know, will trickle down into things like affordable housing debates. You know, I can't get as many houses on here now. The value of the development is reduced. Therefore, I can't provide other planning gain that you would like me to provide because simply I can't. You know, it doesn't stack up financially. I think it's got quite wide-ranging, potentially unforeseen consequences, which will be challenged through the development management process. We'll have to see where we go.
Thank you, Mark, for that. I noticed that the paragraph doesn't actually state that existing trees should be retained. So unfortunately, it will not be.
I think it does, Andrew. I think it does say existing trees should be retained. Yeah.
Oh, right.
What it doesn't do, perhaps deliberately, is define what a street is, which might be an area of wriggle room. What's a street? I can see people having all sorts of fun and games trying to define what a street is. In some people's mind, a street goes from one place to another. Is a cul-de-sac a street?
Yeah.
I think that's where the potential wriggle room might arise, but we'll see.
Thank you for that, Mark. May I just say, I mean, it wasn't here to nail anybody today or to, but I think, we've just got a basic paragraph here. And I saw as you were discussing and putting back to my question or comment, other nods of approval or nods of points that were going to be relevant. I think we are going to face a test case, and I think it's going to be sooner rather than later. And I think at the end of the day, it's not what is a tree, it's how old is a tree and how old is that tree or whatever that we're going to have to put into a development should we see fit and the space to put it in. But the more you think about this, and we are in a leafy area, and that's because of our constitution, the way that it's built and where it is something that's going to be more relevant to us, I think, because of the trees that we have, than, as you say, borough council in a situation where there's high development. We are going to get these crossover areas, probably North Walsham, as you say, and Cromer, and probably Fakenham as well in due course. But I just thought it was very relevant, and the more that you've discussed, without taking up any more time, the more horrors and pitfalls are in there. Thank you.
Yes, I've just noticed Councillor Toy's made a comment that there were 31 tree work applications in a conservation area in a month. With all our conservation areas, how many have we got? 80 or so?
81, 82.
81. This is obviously going to be a significant demand on our resources. Can I bring in Councillor Pauline Grove-Jones, who's been waiting very patiently. Over to you, Pauline.
As ever. Just three things I wanted to bring up. One was carrying on from Nigel's point about trees. The new development we have here, the two new developments, one is the Hopkins development and one is now the McCarthy and Stone. Neither of them have trees on their street scenes because the streets are too narrow and so are the pavements. Also, I was always brought up to believe that trees lined avenues. This is what an avenue is. If you look up the definition, it's an area which has trees either side. Trees are beautiful, but they raise the pavements. They do all sorts of things, which then you'll start getting people complaining. So I think you're right, Mark. We just have to take it as it comes. It would be beautiful if we could have, but it's impossible in certain areas. And I think Nigel Dixon's new development, the Persimmon development, Hovden, neither. That hasn't got any trees along the streets either. So anyways, that was the one. The other one is this term outstanding and beautiful. They're subjective terms. I find it strange that the government should put these into their plans, because what I consider beautiful, as we've said, somebody else will think is pug ugly. And outstanding, as you said, Mark, I'm with you. Many of the new buildings I think are outstanding. Other people will also think they're pug ugly. So I think that's going to be quite controversial to try and stimulate. And it takes me back to the development in Hokum of that single dwelling in the open countryside that got through on Para 79. And boy, did that cause some controversy. The other thing is the government's plan, which I was reading about over the weekend, to propose the removal of all gas boilers by, is it 2035? I'm not too sure when, and using the introduction of hydrogen energy and heat source pumps, either surface heat source pumps or underground. Both of them, the heat source pumps are extremely expensive. And as they said in the articles, you can't just put them into existing buildings which are not environmentally insulated, because it's just a waste of time. So not only if that does come in, will the houses that are being built would have to be fully insulated when they put in the heat source pumps, as we've had at Walcott, the application for the social housing to have heat source pumps. That's got to be taken into consideration, because it'll push up the price of market housing and affordable housing. That's all I wanted to say. There's just that it's a little gathering of things that I felt we have probably discussed, but I'm putting it back into the pitch again.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Councillor Grove-Jones. Right, I just want to draw a conclusion then to this particular item. I think we're all
Just
agreed.
got Councillor Dixon wants to speak.
Sorry, I beg your pardon, Councillor Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for not joining you at 10 o'clock, but I do have a question which I wonder if Mark can just flesh out perhaps a little bit more around the tree and indeed the habitat considerations. So I noticed that habitat isn't actually mentioned amongst your briefing. I wonder whether it's something that's in there somewhere with regard to the emphasis that should be given to habitat. And in the context of that, of course, trees is just one part of the habitat mix. The other very valuable vegetation that ought to be in there is the value of hedges. There is too much, in my view, emphasis placed on trees. And of course, the one thing that we don't do when we talk about trees is to try and identify those trees which have the greatest contribution in terms of biodiversity. And when it comes to selecting trees for our streets, for example, there's a whole range of trees that you certainly wouldn't pick because they are not compatible with that type of environment. And there are many others that are. They're of a dwarf variety, they are of a habit that would be suitable and would be in keeping with the environment in which they're being planted. So I think there's a lot of work that probably could be done in terms of expanding the advice or guidance on the use of trees. But I just wonder, in terms of habitat, because this is really, I think the real title that should be here is habitat, because habitat and biodiversity and all of that kind of fairly specialist knowledge that I'm not up to speed on totally, but I do worry that we become overly focused on like trees, for example, without having that wider picture of biodiversity and connecting up areas that we set aside as, you know, habitat enhancement areas, and they become little islands and they don't really function in the way that they could to add as much value as we would like to see. So was there any mention of habitat in the more general sense, Mark, in there?
Right, okay. So I think you used two terms there, and the one that does appear is the biodiversity gain, Nigel. So I think that's the government's sort of watchword, if you like, for habitat more generally. They've adopted this biodiversity net gain sort of requirement. What's happening behind the scenes is some development of some quite sophisticated sort of measuring and matrix sort of tools, which developers and local authorities will be able to use to establish what is the true value on the site as it exists today. How do you measure biodiversity? Is a tree more important than a hedge? Is a Lelandii tree more important than a laburnum tree or whatever? And the system that's emerging is you're going to be able to fill in a sort of templated sort of approach, probably with a whole army of qualified ecologists sat behind it, saying what the value of a 50-year-old oak tree is compared to a 25-year-old length of hedgerow. You will get a set amount of credits for what's on the site, add your 10% on, and that's your target for your new development. And the target for the new development is a sort of, it's a triage sort of approach where the biodiversity gain is firstly delivered on the site itself. And in many places that won't be difficult. If you're converting a monoculture agricultural field into a field of houses, you're probably delivering a net biodiversity gain just through all the residential garden areas compared to the field of wheat, you know, if you leave the hedgerow boundaries and so on. So although it sounds like quite an onerous requirement, unless you've got a very biodiverse, rich site in the first place, most developers are going to be able to cope with this requirement to provide 10% improvement on the site itself with a bit of careful thought. If you can't do it on the site, there's then provision for off-site replacement habitat elsewhere, and that's where you get into the connectivity and joining spaces up and so on. It's a move in the right direction, isn't it? You know, we've gone from a position where trees and landscaping have been largely regarded as a sort of visual thing, a nice to have, whereas we're now looking at the much wider benefits around well-being, wildlife, drainage, you know, all that other stuff, which is relevant to the landscaping proposal, is all being embodied into the guidance. So I think it's got to be a good thing. It's going to take a little bit of time for it to work through into the system. Probably what I'd say with some confidence, I'll pick Nigel's patch. I think the Persimmon Homes development in you know, that's been built there wouldn't have stood any chance of complying with these new requirements. It is a step change, it is a move forward. So I think that sort of volume house builder, you know, where we develop every square inch and lay tarmac everywhere, put a bit of grass down in the middle and call it open space. Hopefully we can move beyond that point and actually get something which is, you know, a genuine improvement from where we are. That's clearly the intention. And that's what our policies are going to require.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Does that answer your queries, Councillor Dixon?
Yes, that's fine. Thank
Yep.
you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Councillor Toy finally, and then I want to draw a conclusion to this particular item because we need to move progress. Councillor Toy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, it's just for Councillor Dixon. As an aside, what's running with this is the new Environment Bill, and there's a lot of stuff about biodiversity, about local networks. So there's a lot of information there that may well feed into what we're doing here, but that bill's coming along, and that does address a lot of the stuff, which is where the 10% biodiversity net gain came from, was from the Environment Bill. So it will tie in. So hopefully this will improve as we go along.
Yes, I think it's perhaps going to be another 12 months before that comes actually into legislation. So I believe. Right. I think, Matt, we just need to note this report, do we not? We don't need to actually take a vote on it.
Yeah, according to the agenda. Yep.
Yep. Thank you very much. Right. I'd just like to draw a conclusion to that particular item and move on to agenda item 8, which is another item to progress the local plan and small growth villages policy. Just before I hand over to Mark, I would say that we need to be mindful that the local plan has to progress to inspection as soon as is conveniently possible. And we need to move, I think, to a point fairly soon. And I'm sure that Mark will bear me out on this, where we bring an item to the working party, which is like a sweeping up item, where we mop up all the loose ends in the local plan, at which point we then need to call an end to the policy debate and get the local plan drafted into a stage where we can submit it to the inspector. So I believe this is again for you, Mark. So if I may hand over to you.
Yeah, so can I just again confirm you can see my screen with part of a green box on it?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is one of the sort of fundamental sort of policies in the new local plan, which largely determines where you can and cannot get planning permission. So it's the policy which sets out the settlement hierarchy and says we've got large growth towns, small growth towns, large growth villages, and small growth villages. And I'm going to focus on the small growth villages, which actually are those list of places towards the top of the screen there. So Aldborough, Bacton, Baddersfield, I always get that wrong. Nigel no doubt will correct me. Binham, Catfield, Corpus Deeside. So all of those settlements there, we've classified as the small growth villages. And at the outset of the plan, many, many moons ago, each of those small growth villages, we were going to look for allocations in. For those of you who've been around for a long time, we've probably visited a lot of these on minibus trips a couple of years ago and looked at various site options. And you'll recall, as I say, with the outset of plan preparation, we were going to look to allocate sites for development in each of these locations. More latterly, we've decided not to allocate land. So each of these settlements will be defined with a development boundary. So we'll draw a boundary, or we have drawn boundaries around each of them. And within those boundaries, you'll be able to get planning permission for infill developments and changes of uses and subdivision of properties. So, you know, they're villages where you can get a house in your garden if you're lucky enough to have a back garden or a side garden big enough to get a house in, sort of infill development. That's all acceptable within each of these. But what is new is we're introducing the notion that you can build in locations outside of the boundaries. So in areas which are countryside, you can now build housing proposals subject to the criteria at the bottom of this page being met. So the site needs to be immediately abutting the defined development boundary, so adjacent to the place, you know, physically alongside existing buildings. We've put a cap on the amount of development to be built in each of these over the plan period by saying development should not exceed 6% overall. And there's a table of numbers which supports this policy, which tells you what 6% looks like, because 6% in Horning is very different to 6% in Trunch, but there is a number which basically says you can build this many properties over the plan period. And it works as a sort of first come, first served. Once the allowance is used up, then you start refusing planning applications because you've exceeded the 6% allowance. The proposal is supposed to be small scale and incremental growth. So we're not looking at very large schemes, we're favouring the smaller scale schemes. You've got to have safe access, which is obviously a given. You've got to be able to access the development. This clause here says that if you've got development of this nature, it should be supported by the necessary infrastructure and service improvements, connected back to the village, improve GI, which is green infrastructure networks. That all sounds fine. So sort of the intention, as I say, is to allow for small scale growth outside of the boundaries in these defined settlements where those criteria are met. The unforeseen consequence of that, or it was unforeseen at the time, was that in allowing for development beyond the development boundaries of these villages, so in areas which are designated as countryside, you are creating development potential on land which previously didn't have any. And land that previously didn't have any development potential, where you couldn't build houses on it, was the sort of land that ended up going into the Rural Exceptions Programme and being built on by housing associations to deliver affordable housing. And that's absolutely key to the way that affordable housing is delivered in the district, is planning policies create an expectation that you can't get planning permission for anything else more valuable, and therefore your best interests as a landowner lie in selling your land to a housing association to deliver affordable homes. If you're building market housing, you might get 10 or 15 times existing use value for your land. So you're getting a very, very substantial uplift if you can build housing in the countryside. As an affordable housing plot, you might get 2 or 3 times existing use value, certainly not 10 or 12 times existing use value. And it's that substantial reduction in land value which allows housing associations to purchase land very cheaply or comparatively cheaply, which drives the rural exceptions programme in North Norfolk. Now, clearly, one of the concerns with this policy was that we are creating the hope value, the real hope value, that a landowner can now get permission to build market housing on these sites, thereby depriving the opportunity of a housing association delivering the rural exceptions programme. So the text in red is a suggested addition, which we hope is a measure which will address that risk. It says, in the case of sites in excess of 1/4 of a hectare, so excluding all but the smallest sites, the land first must be offered to a local registered social landlord on agreed terms, which would allow its development for affordable homes, and such an offer has been declined. So in a sense, essentially what that means is housing associations get first dibs on suitable land, and we do not release that land for market housing unless it's first been offered to a housing association and a housing association has confirmed we're not interested, it's not suitable for us. We've been deliberately vague on the terms, which have first been agreed, because those terms need to be pretty strict and carefully sort of drafted. At what price has the land got to be offered? For how long has it got to be offered? Who determines whether it's suitable or not? What is the requirement for the landowner to address that policy? Needs to be laid out in a bit of detailed guidance. But the basic premise is affordable housing ought to be prioritised in these locations, and we shouldn't do anything which compromises or might compromise the delivery of useful rural exceptions development in these locations. So that's the first of 2 recommendations that we had that clause F in. The second recommendation relates to Haysborough. I'm hoping this is straightforward. To qualify as a selected small village, you have to meet certain qualification criteria. You've got to have a shop or a school and 4 other services. You'll recall a little time back, we removed Langham from the list of small villages because Langham no longer qualified with the selection criteria. Much the same thing's now happened in Haysborough, where the village shop is, I think it's either shut or about to shut. Certainly the post office is shut. So Haysborough no longer meets the selection criteria which underpins this policy. So 2 recommendations there, one that Haysborough is removed, and the second that we add clause F into the policy for small growth villages. That's me finished, Chair.
Thank you for that, Mark. Before throwing it open, can I just clarify just 1 or 2 things? We've put in paragraph 1.3 on page 17, first bullet point, sites should be no more than a hectare in size.
Yeah.
Now, if we look at clause F as drafted at the moment, it gives a minimum extent of 0.25 hectares. Should that be amended to read between 0.25 hectares and 1 hectare?
It could be useful clarification in the case of sites in excess of 0.25 hectares, because the 1 hectare upper limit doesn't actually appear in this policy as draft, does it? It appears in the yeah.
Yeah, it's because I'm looking at the paragraph C in the preceding section, where it says small scale incremental growth. Yeah. Obviously, that's a moving feast in itself, isn't it? In the sense that what is small scale incremental growth to one developer may not be necessarily to another. So I was just wondering whether that might might need to be looked at slightly. And the other thing as well, at the risk of sounding like the self-appointed chairman of the Neighbourhood Plan Association, can I just clarify with you that if a neighbourhood plan has a policy within it which is at odds with this particular policy, should this policy wording make it clear and acknowledge in the text that the local development plan, neighbourhood plan, should prevail in instances where there is a contradiction, so to speak? Can I just ask you what your thought is on that?
I'll deal with the first point first. I think it's a useful addition to this policy, because I can't actually see it in the wording, to make absolutely clear that the 1 hectare is the upper limit. So if that's done via a modification, as you suggest, to talk about sites between 0.25 hectares and 1 hectare, or by adding an additional clause in, the site does not exceed 1 hectare in size, I think that is a useful qualification to the policy, because that's clearly the intention here. I mean, 1 hectare is actually quite large in some of these villages, and will probably not comply with the remaining aspects of the policy anyway. It's an upper limit rather than an entitlement. But I think that qualification would be useful. So if you want to recommend that as a modification, something you wouldn't argue against.
Yeah.
The relationship with neighbourhood plans is an interesting one. You could caveat nearly every policy in this book with said clause, because there are potential areas of conflict which will emerge in neighbourhood plans as they're drafted, not just the ones we currently got, but the new ones which come through, which may not fully comply with the policy wording we've got here. And a decision would have to be made about, which of the 2 strands of policy would take precedence in the decision-making process. I would tend towards the view that the later the policy is, if you've got a neighbourhood plan which post-dates our plan, then you would give weight to the neighbourhood plan that post-dates our plan. For those that are already in place, and I assume you might be referring to Corpusty and Saxthorpe here, if there's something directly at odds in our policy with one which is in the Corpusty plan, and you wanted to make the Corpusty plan the priority plan for that particular decision, a footnote or a qualification could be added here. So you could say, you could put footnote in this policy, other than in Corpusty and Saxthorpe, where policy of the neighbourhood plan will apply. There's nothing wrong with putting that type of qualification in. I'm not sure what conflict you might be referring to, though, Andrew, here, and whether this does scupper something in the neighbourhood plan or not.
No, it was just more a generic thought, really, that we ought to be not only for existing neighbourhood plans, but perhaps catering for neighbourhood plans that are in the pipeline. And we know there are 3 or 4 in addition to the 2 existing ones, just to make it absolutely clear. And I did sort of ask myself before I raised this point that perhaps elsewhere in the local plan, we've covered the point in a more general guidance section. And if we have, it wouldn't do any harm to restate it in this section, because obviously people are going to look at this in isolation in some respects, and they're not going to trawl through our local plan to see what we think about the relationship.
I think in practice, we're likely to give priority to the neighbourhood plan, aren't we? We did so, the most recent example is Great Ryborough. Great Ryborough, you remember the development committee gave planning permission for an infill plot on the basis that the Great Ryborough neighbourhood plan defined a development boundary and the plot was inside the development boundary. Entirely contrary to our current core strategy and this plan, which doesn't designate Great Ryborough as one of the selected villages at all. But in that scenario, we rightly, in my view, gave priority to the neighbourhood plan, its local decision making. It's been through a referendum, it's adopted as a local approach to development in that village, and therefore it was right to give priority to that particular policy. And I would have thought that would almost routinely have been the case. You know, we're supportive of neighbourhood plans where they've gone through due process. We've not raised an objection. We're supportive of their preparation. If they've got a policy in them that's slightly different to ours, we're comfortable with that policy because we haven't objected to it. Then it follows that you use that policy to make the decision against. That explicitly stated. I don't think actually putting it in individual policies, as I perhaps suggested just now, is perhaps the best way of doing it. It probably wants to go up front in the plan somewhere in the way the plan works to explain the relationship between the local plan and neighbourhood planning in North Norfolk, and actually put those words of comfort somewhere in the document rather than look to modify every policy.
Yeah, I think, perhaps as a compromise situation, the general words go elsewhere in the local plan. And in this particular section, we put a footnote referring the reader to the general remarks section. Would that be a way forward?
Okay. Yeah, I can take that on board. Yeah.
Right. If I can throw, sorry about that, members. If I can throw it wide open to the floor. If you would like to take the graphic down, Mark, I can then perhaps see who are raising hands. Right. We have restoration. Would anyone like to raise any questions or queries or points of clarification? Councillor Grove-Jones, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I was interested with this system where the land has to be offered to social housing development first, if it's between 0.25 and now we say we are going to add the 1 hectare. Can I just put in an existing situation which is at Catfield, where we have land which is being developed for affordable housing, we think. The trouble is with this, Mark, with offering land to housing for affordable housing development, is the NIMBYism, is the fact that a lot of people do not want this housing within their area. Such is life. People have their opinions. I've also been talking to people over the weekend that before affordable housing was the term used, it used to be council housing. And if you looked at many of the small villages in England, at the edge of the village, which is what this is doing, there would be several council houses built to support the agricultural workers. So I know my brother lives in Somerset and he lives at Broome. And if you go through the village, a very pretty village, you will find at the edge a row of council houses. But nobody complained about it then. We seem to have developed a situation where people seem to think that affordable housing is detrimental to their area. Not always, but in quite a lot. Just wanted to bring that up. Okay, that's fine. On to the next one.
Is that all you're wanting to raise?
Yes,
Paul?
it was just,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
it was just that, as always, you have to think around these things.
Yeah, well, if I can talk in code, maybe the Housing Act 1980 didn't do a great deal for community cohesion in respect of council housing and the introduction of the right to buy procedures, but we'll move swiftly on from that. Would anyone else like to raise?
You've got Councillor Nigel Pearce, Paul Heinrich, Nigel Dixon and Victoria Holiday.
Right, so Councillor Pearce, over to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I have to say that I'm very pleased to see the potential introduction of taking social housing opportunities up to 1 hectare. I don't have to overstate again here my belief in we need desperately to build social housing for our local people who cannot afford market type housing, especially coming in from, shall we say, the rich areas of the country, namely big cities. But also, we as law can't legislate against it. So we've got to build against second homes or whatever. So therefore, we've got to build protection within our local plans. I do think that all villages should take some social housing, and whatever that term may be, rented accommodation, whatever, it's going to be redefined in the future. I'm very pleased to see it. Would it be possible? I mean, I know for the discounts for housing association, and it is sort of sometimes a little bit woolly, that when these plans are announced and formally done, that they be given a grace period to say, look, we've already got one, but when the idea is mooted, so that the potential landowner cannot sit back for a year and let the value of his land increase, a la land banking. I mean, we need to be moving very, very quickly, and we do move. There's no criticism. But the point is, we all know, and as Pauline has just said, NIMBYism and everything else does slow the procedure down considerably. So therefore, the value that is put to a parcel of land, say now, but the planning authority agreements then go through and it's then approved that this area we put aside so-and-so, 18 months later, the land can triple in value. And the housing association cannot afford, even given the discount price, to purchase that land. I think we're going to go down this up to 1 hectare stipulation. And I think we've got to see ourselves as trying to help the housing association, housing charities a bit more. So that was my suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, so that we could introduce a local land development tax and take land back after 5 years if it's not built out to the par value. But I suspect that we wouldn't get anywhere because we would be challenged in the courts if we did. Can I hand over to Councillor Heinrich next?
Thank you, Chairman. It's just refining the suggestion of amendment to this one under 3A were to read the site immediately butts a defined development boundary and does not exceed 1 hectare in size. I think that covers it. Would I be right there, Mark? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for that. Now then, Councillor Dixon next, and then Councillor Holiday.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to say that I certainly agree with the changes that are proposed, and in particular, the latest change with regard to the quarter to 1 hectare development. So I think that those are very worthy changes. I've really only got one observation to make, and that's in relation to, and Mark won't be surprised at this, I don't, Houghton is in your group of small growth towns, and amongst your plethora of documents, Houghton gets mentioned as either a small growth town or a large village, and there is a little bit of a potential for a double whammy in this, because I can't argue that the township of Houghton and Wroxham is precisely that. It is a township. But unlike the other places mentioned in that particular paragraph on page 21, Houghton and Wroxham, of course, is split between the two local authorities. And if both those two local authorities see those respective large or small growth towns as deserving of an appropriate amount of development, then it means that both of them take a disproportionate share. What I'm really saying is I don't really have a problem in recognising Houghton for what it is, but I think that we have this confusion of terms for it. In one place, it's a small growth town. In another place, it's a large village. And I think in most regards, certainly the residents of Houghton would see it as a large growth village, quite reasonably. And they probably wouldn't have too much difficulty in the small growth town if they could be sure that the treatment of Houghton and Wroxham was going to be appropriate for those two local planning authorities, and not caught, you know, with the larger impositions of both of them. So I'm not comfortable with Houghton being termed in that way. I just think that there is but maybe there's scope to qualify that in some way.
Yeah, okay. So just to be absolutely clear, Houghton is not one of the small growth villages, so would not sit underneath this policy at all. So development outside of the boundary of Houghton would be in the countryside and would be subject to countryside development management policies. So the issue, in a sense, doesn't arrive in Houghton. The locations outside of the boundary remain in the countryside and are only available for rural exceptions development. We can clarify the terminology, you know, village and town in the plan. What will happen, Nigel, is that each of these phrases, which have got specific meanings and are policy tools, if you like, will be shown in bold in the document and will appear in the glossary. So the term small growth town or large growth town or small growth village is not just descriptive, it has a policy function. And where that happens and where those words have a policy function, so a good example is we use the term countryside, but we don't actually just describe countryside, we use it in the way we say countryside policy area, and countryside policy area will appear in bold and will appear in the glossary and will have a specific meaning to distinguish the fact we're not just talking about the countryside with a small c, as somewhere we all go and visit on our holidays. We are defining a specific policy area in the plan that has a policy function. It is a bit difficult with Houghton because it's a small growth town, but everybody thinks of it as a large village. The small growth town having the policy function, the large village being a description of the place. But I'm sure it's not beyond the wit of the team to put some wording in the preamble to this policy, which makes clear that Houghton is actually a village, although it's described as a small growth town for policy purposes.
That would be appreciated. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that, Mark. Over to Councillor Holliday.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I've got several points. I agree about the affordable housing and the delay that usually goes with that, and that if you offer a piece of land, it might be quite a long time before the Affordable Housing Act gets together, and so you have to be quite wary of that, I think, Mark, in that particular F, I think it is. I'm rather anti this prospect, actually, because of all the small growth villages I know, if you put 6% of the houses, let's say Weybourne, that's 24 houses right on one end, because that's where the land is, you're going to have houses quite well distributed from limited local services there are, and you're going to have a lot of people driving to the local village shop because they're not going to walk along the road, which is terribly unsafe. And I know you say that access is an important, safe and convenient access is important, but that's going to make it quite difficult, I think, for many of these villages. What percentage of the houses will be either for primary residents or local occupancy? Because otherwise in some of these villages, we're going to get a lot of second homers coming in and they're not going to benefit the village at all in terms of sustainability. And I don't think that's probably the intention of this particular policy. And are the affordable houses going to be within these developments as well as within the exception side that might be developed instead? I'm assuming that that's the case. And I agree with, I think it was you, Andrew, who said that, what do you mean by small scale incremental growth? I mean, that's could be anything to anybody. And I think that's quite a loose terminology. And I just wondered why these small areas of land were being developed in the countryside instead of in the towns where perhaps it was a little bit less intrusive.
Right, okay. So the basic premise of the small growth villages is they are locations where there are some supporting services. They're not obviously blessed with a full range of everything, but to qualify, they must have one of three essential services. So we define an essential service as a village shop, a village school, or a doctor's surgery. There are only 3 or 4 villages in the whole of North Norfolk have got a doctor's surgery. There's probably about 35 or 40 have got a village or a school, and they must have one or other of those 2 things, plus 4 other non-essential services. The non-essential services were things like pubs, village halls, churches, other, if you like, sort of things that people use in their community. The Working Party decided a long time ago what that methodology was and which of the villages should be categorised in that way. Overall, they're expected to deliver about 350 to 400 houses across the entirety of the plan period. So if you think that plan is delivering about 10,000 houses in total, this tier of villages is expected to accommodate about 400. And of those 400, some of, depending on the size of the site, will be affordable homes. So the affordable housing policy kicks in on schemes of 5 or more dwellings, I think, in these locations, beyond which you start to get into delivering some affordable homes. So it's a specific mechanism to deliver a modest amount of housing growth to support the services which are there and to deliver some affordable housing, hopefully in a relatively benign, low-key way. The 1 hectare threshold is the upper limit rather than entitlement. And I think there might be some value in actually describing that in the preamble to the policy. I think the notion that a 1 hectare site gets slapped onto the side of Weybourne would be quite challenging. That's 30 houses on the edge of the village is quite a big development proposal in a single location for that type of development. You'd have to act pretty quickly to bag all 30 because it's a diminishing allowance. The 6% figure which is in there is deliberately in there as a sort of use it or lose it provision. Once it's gone, it is gone. So if you get sort of 2 or 3 schemes of 5 or 6 houses, much of the allowance in Weybourne will be used up by those sort of 2 or 3 schemes. And I suppose it's about how do we give those smaller schemes priority and don't end up with Hopkins Homes or Norfolk Homes or one of the other big house builders coming along and seeing the opportunity to deliver 30 houses in a field. I would hope that the adverse consequences of building 30 houses on the side of Weybourne would be sufficient for the development committee to refuse permission. It sounds like a pretty unacceptable form of development, and the words are in the policy. It says small scale and organic, or I haven't got the words up on the screen at the moment, deliberately in there to give the development committee the room to say this scale of development is inappropriate in this location. If you think 1 hectare is too big, you could reduce it, but of course you're then diminishing the opportunities substantially for development in these locations. And it's a sort of, where do you draw the line sort of question. Can't remember what else you asked me, Victoria. Yes, these schemes, if they're large enough, do deliver affordable houses as well. They're not subject to second homes restrictions. All affordable housing will be, because obviously an affordable house, you've got to live locally in order to occupy it. Other houses are built as principal residences, and the Working Party, again, has debated the second homes restrictions on various occasions and has concluded that they won't work, they won't do what is intended by imposing restrictions on a relatively small percentage of the housing stock with just deflecting demand elsewhere. So we don't think that's an effective tool to control occupancy. So yes, these proposals are very deliberately intended to deliver small quantities of both market and affordable housing in this tier of settlements.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Anyone else wishing to, before we draw this to a conclusion, to raise any comment or any queries that they would like to ask at this stage?
Councillor Fisher.
Councillor Fisher. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we just change in paragraph the word offer to offered, please? I'm sorry to be pedantic.
In which section, Peter?
F.
In F.
F.
First been offered with an ED.
Yeah. Yeah, just a typographical error. I presume, Mark, that's what was intended. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Councillor Fisher, for that amendment. Right, so just to summarise, I was sort of initially concerned that this might be perceived by people in our community to be, as it were, a fast track to offering sites for market rate development in instances where perhaps our registered social landlords are overloaded with offers of land. But I don't think that will be the case. I think the numbers that would max out if each village had a site offered to them would be fairly modest over the plan period. So I think my concerns about in that respect have been somewhat allayed. I think also what we have to bear in mind is that our principal developments in such as Fakenham and North Walsham will probably take several years, if not decades, to be built out. And therefore this particular tweak to the policy gives some flexibility to deliver numbers towards our housing targets. So in that respect, if used properly, I think will be a benefit for our local plan. So before I move to the recommendations, we've got, I think, 3 amendments. We've got clarity on the neighbourhood plan and how it impacts on neighbourhood plans, as discussed. We've got the amendment to cap to a maximum of 1 hectare, although we've noted that the development doesn't have to be up to 1 hectare. It can be between 0.25 and 1. And we've also got clarity on the status of Houghton being a small growth village for the purposes of the qualifications. So with those 3 slight amendments to the recommendation, or taking those into account, we've got recommendation 1, which we need to vote on, that Haysborough is removed from the list of small growth villages using the same criteria that we applied to Langham. It follows that we should do that. And secondly, that additional policy criteria are added to ensure that rural exceptions, affordable housing schemes are prioritised in small growth villages. Matt, if we move to a vote, do we need a roll call vote on this?
Yes, you can do. Yeah, I just note that Councillor Pearce has a hand raised. I'm not sure if that's a legacy hand or if he wants to add anything.
Oh, it wasn't a legacy hand. I've got something for the next item. It was a bit of a quick hand, so I'll take it away.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, in that case, Andrew, if you have a proposer and a seconder, and it's up to you if you want to take the vote on those recommendations on block, you can do so.
Right, okay. Do I have a proposer for this policy? Councillor Grove-Jones, and a seconder? Councillor Heinrich? Councillor Heinrich, second. So I think we can do it all on block, perhaps, Matt, can we?
Yep.
Yep. So all those in favour of this proposal, please raise your hand. And against? And I take it there are no abstentions. I think that covers everybody. I think I see broad approval for that. I take it that's carried, Matt.
Yes, it looks to be unanimous. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, members, for your contributions on that. That was a very useful and helpful debate. Moving on to the agenda, item 9. I have no discretionary business under that item. We have no press and public.
Just note that Councillor Pearce has his hand raised now for I think, item 9.
Item 9. Over to you, Councillor Pearce.
I'm open, yes. So I'm just thinking on what we discussed this morning, and it's just a suggestion. And if everybody wants to shout me down, then please do so. I think probably as a committee, bearing in mind what's going to happen in the future, and also our, shall we say, planning longevity with developers, etc. Is there any way that a another meeting to look at our social housing policy with aspect to the developer, not to the council's own operation, and what could be allowed in the future and what we could go, because we're hearing, as always do, conflicting reports. And I just thought maybe if Mark can put something here, can we have a clarification meeting or something where we could actually discuss this or put it on an item on the agenda so that we all know what our policies are in the future going forward for low cost, affordable housing, rented housing, etc. Because this is going to come up time and time again. If we look at our level of housing needs on our housing list of 2,500 families that within this our area that need accommodation, it's a problem that we're never going to solve. But I think we should make some efforts, as we do, but obviously to increase our imprint into that problem. It's just a suggestion. If everybody wants to say we don't want another meeting or an item, that's fine. But I just thought with this morning is an item that I thought would be really relevant to be put forward.
Mark, do you want to come in on that?
We have, I think, pretty routinely, I would say almost on an annual basis, run joint workshops with colleagues in housing. Nikki's come along, Planet have been present. We've done stuff where we've involved all of the housing associations in developing, a most recent example, developing a housing strategy. That was a very consultative sort of process, which involved members, it involved the housing associations and other developers in preparing that document. So it does appear as a sort of, if you like, a training or an updating sort of topic area, fairly routinely on a sort of fairly regular basis. But if members have got an appetite to do something else, what are the nuts and bolts of affordable housing delivery? How does it work in North Norfolk? What do our policies say, and how do things actually work in practice? If there's an appetite for it, I'm sure something could be done.
What I was going to say, Mark, as I say, is the fact that these needs are changing all the time. I mean, I'm in my second term as a councillor, and it's changed from the first time when I came on to what it is now. And we're still not through the situation where developers will try and get away, and I know it's a standard course of action, to get away with building as few low-cost homes, rented homes as possible. But I just think that, we've got to be a bold council, and it wasn't a routine. We can put it as an item on the agenda and keep it within our committee. But I do think we have to be as clued in as possible, as often as possible, to the changing needs. And let's face it, everybody said this morning, 4 years ago, we weren't even looking at climate change. Now we've got to look at the possibility of putting trees into design. Do we put trees at the low-cost housing areas? All these kind of things, and you yourself mentioned that this morning. I just thought that maybe some time then in one of the next planning policy meetings to have this item on the agenda, so that we look at it from the developer's point of view on a commercial thing, not as a policy within what we require, because this problem is not going to go away.
I think maybe we could look at this in the context of a statement of common ground with developers. I was thinking that when we were discussing about trees, that was perhaps an area that could go in a statement of common ground, so that developers know what to expect from the planning department of the council, well in advance of them actually submitting, their application. It's almost sort of an expansion of the pre-application service. I don't know whether that's something that might justify us looking at this as an agenda item, Mark?
Well, I was going to ask, Chair, I think there was an outstanding request from elsewhere to have a look at the first homes introduction, the stuff that's come into the National Planning Policy Framework and the implications on that on affordable delivery generally, because it's obviously a new product type, it's unfamiliar to a lot of people, will have impacts on housing mix. I don't know whether there's a request for Nikki to do something for members. I have a recollection we were going to discuss with Councillor Fredericks whether there was an opportunity to do something, and I don't know via what forum. Do you want to leave it with me to discuss whether there's a possibility of doing something more of a general sort of update, but perhaps a specific agenda picking up some of these, targeted sort of issues? That's the point. That's me taking my bets that you'll leave it with me and I'll sort something out in due course.
Please. Yeah. I mean, I can make a note to raise it with you for our next meetings.
The point Nigel makes is a good one. This thing is it's always in flux. We've got some new affordable products. We've got new national guidance. I don't know what's going on at the moment around grant funding and Homes England role and so on and so forth. There might be an opportunity to get one or two of the providers in, or a developer's perspective about our policies in some sort of little workshop exercise. But again, I'm going to make the point that it's sort of resource dependent and actually getting the right people around the table at the right time. So I'm not promising that's going to happen sort of next week by any means. But
we can have a look at that, Councillor Pearce. Thank you, Mark, for that. I think that closes that item off, doesn't it? Item 9 on the agenda. So we move to item 10, exclusion of press and public.
John Toy has a hand raised.
Sorry, he's off. He's not on my screen. I apologise. Councillor Toy.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Andrew. It's around the point that Nigel Dixon raised. Not Nigel Pearce. Apologies, too many Nigels. My apologies for that. No, Councillor Pearce raised the question there at item 9. And I also think it's whether in that mix when we're discussing it, Mark, it's something to think about when it comes back. I do get concerned that when viability changes, that it's the affordable homes that get lost. So, for example, at the moment we've seen building costs have gone up. So the viability changes, the developer keeps his profit, we lose affordable homes, and that there should be some loss perhaps on both sides so that we understand their situation, but they should understand ours. So it's about this. They sit on land, costs go up, the viability changes, they want to take affordable homes and they don't lose anything, we lose. So it'd be interesting to have some information about what we may or may not be able to do around that side of the house as well, the developer side. As Nigel Pearce said, we need to look at that side.
That's a very good point that you make, actually, John. The viability criteria has been changing. I've had discussions with the housing policy team on that. So, yes, that would be a useful update for the working party when we bring it forward, as Councillor Pearce has requested. So, yes, I think we should do that, definitely. Moving forward. I will get to item 10, I hope, Matt.
You're all good, yep.
Thank you very much. So with no exclusion of press and public necessary, and with no exempt matters or business that I'm aware of under items 11 or 12 to bring forward. So I think at this juncture, at almost midday, if I can close the meeting. And thank you everyone for your attendance this morning and for your assistance to the working party. And we look forward to our next one in September. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.